Oh, hello. Welcome to Colin's Chekhov Corner. My name is Colin Martin, for those of you who don't know me. I'm an acting teacher at OCSA's Acting Conservatory. This will be my 6th year. I teach Shakespeare and movement and acting and play reading and stage combat. I've directed a few plays at OCSA. Next year, I'll be directing Anton Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard. And a quick reminder, today's episode of Colin's Chekhov Corner is brought to you by COVID-19. Screw you, COVID. So why The Cherry Orchard? Well, aside from the fact that Anton Chekhov is one of our most beloved classical playwrights, this play in particular has a special fascination with me because it reminds me a lot of my own family. I don't want to bore you too much with the details, but a few generations ago my family had some restaurants in Kansas City. We had a nice big house by an orange grove, and unfortunately due to some bad planning and unfortunate decisions, our family lost its fortune and we had to move from the house, and the orange grove that it bordered was chopped down. So there's that, and there's also the sort of the characters. We have some very interesting characters in my family, and my father wrote a play called The Orange Grove, which was based loosely on The Cherry Orchard, and it paralleled not only the story very closely, but also the character types. So it's a personal sort of adventure for me to be directing this particular play. Another reason that I want to do this play, I've seen this play several times, and I've never seen it done the way I think it was intended. We can't help but look at forms of art from other cultures and time periods through the lens of our own cultural bias. And what that means for Chekhov is that his plays are seen by a modern eye as being very maudlin, depressing affairs where the characters sit around and gripe and reminisce and complain, and nothing ever happens, and it's all very depressing and sad. But I don't believe anything could be further from what Chekhov intended. In fact, he said of this play, "The Cherry Orchard is a vaudeville. The whole thing is cheerful and frivolous." More on that later. But I think it's important to try to get to that and try to produce a play in the way that it was intended to be produced. Now, in order to understand exactly how Chekhov could have thought that this play was cheerful and frivolous, I think we need to take a step back and look at the broader historical and cultural context, and look at the world in which Chekhov was writing his plays. So let's take a look at a brief history of Russia. Back in 800 AD, Russia was ununified. It was a collection of small family clans and tribes, ununited, unorganized. And in 860 or thereabouts, a Swedish Viking named Rurik led an expedition into the heart of the Russian steppes. And he was approached by some of the local tribe leaders and was asked to unify the tribes and bring them all together and form a new nation. And his name was Rurik, and so his people were the Rus, and that part of the world became the land of the Rus. So in 1618, the first Romanov was elected by council to start a new dynasty and maintain the government that had been established. As you may know, the Romanovs led the Russian government for 300 years up until the overthrow in 1917. Alexei was the second Romanov ruler, instituted the Sobornaya Ulozhenie, which converted all of Russia's peasants, 80% of the population, into serfs. The serfs were property of the landowners. They were given no access to education. They were not allowed to travel. They inherited their titles. There was no mobility for them at all. They were basically slaves in all but name. And this was 80% of the population at the time. And it stayed that way for 200 years, up until they were granted freedom in 1861. We'll get to that in a second. So in the 200-year time period between the institution of serfdom and its end, Russia experienced a lot of back and forth cultural whiplash, sometimes going for the sort of European liberalism, the progressive Renaissance, and then swinging from that to more authoritarian rule, where no one was allowed any freedoms at all. And that went back and forth a couple of times between 1650 and 1850. Catherine the Great was very progressive. She really embraced the French liberalism, the idealism of the time, and she wanted people to come into Russia and Europify it, basically, and liberalize it. When the French Revolution happened in the late 1700s, Catherine the Great was horrified that in Paris and in France, of all places, the heart of liberal idealism, that the peasants would be so ungrateful as to murder the people that brought them that glorious culture. And so she completely turned her back on the French idealism that defined her early reign, and clamped down on any rebellion, completely turned her back on that, and just went inward, and then she died a couple of years later. Catherine's grandson, Alexander the First, fought the Napoleonic Wars. He united with Europe against the new revolutionary France and tried to stifle any more European influence in the heart of Russia. Now, this move really alienated the nobility and the upper classes of Russian society, because they had spent so many decades adopting French cultures and attitudes. And with this sudden shift, it really isolated and alienated the rich, moneyed classes of Russia at the time. The soldiers who were coming home from the wars in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars, had seen firsthand how glorious life was in France, how much freedom the peasantry had, and how egalitarian everything was in their societies. So they would come home to Russia, and they became very unsatisfied with the conditions in Russia. So they plotted to overthrow Nicholas I in 1829. But they failed, and Nicholas I clamped down even harder on Western-style democracy and liberalism. And it was around this time, in 1830s, that the Industrial Revolution was really getting going, and the peasantry had more and more power and access to machinery and tools and learning. So more and more revolts were happening all over the place. Most of these were always put down, but when Russia started a southern expansion into Crimea, Europe declared war on Russia to prevent their southern expansion. Combine that with all of the peasant uprisings. Russia's leader, who at the time was Alexander II, had no choice but to release the serfs from their bondage. And in 1861, he ended serfdom. But the problem was that he didn't institute any replacement for that system. So he declared that the serfs were free, but nothing systemic changed. The ex-serfs had no way of improving their situation, so life largely continued as it had before. So this bred a great deal of resentment among Russia's population. And in 1881, a large group of angry peasants assassinated Alexander II, and his successor, Alexander III, became even more autocratic and cracked down on any whiff of a rebellion. So this is the environment in which Chekhov was writing his plays. Nearly half of everyone in Russia were newly freed serfs, but with no real means of exercising that new freedom. They pretty much stayed in place. Then you've got the landowners and the nobility completely unable to tell whether they were coming or going, what with the constantly shifting cultural attitudes. And with all of their serfs newly freed, they had no means of maintaining their income, and everything started to drain away, money-wise, for these landowners. So the serfs and the landowners kind of locked in place, dependent on each other, but unable to generate any income. It became very much like a standing tree that dies in place, and everything is just locked there, desiccating and slowly drying out. On top of all that, we've got the Industrial Revolution changing every aspect of the world at breakneck speed. And in this kind of soup of circumstances, Russia found itself somewhat lost identity-wise, unsure of itself, unable to decide how to deal with the constantly changing world. And that's at the heart of what Chekhov is dealing with in his plays, is the people's ability, his character's ability to either deal with or not deal with change. So this all seems very heavy and serious. So how could Chekhov have possibly thought that The Cherry Orchard was a comedy? I think in order to answer that question, let's first look at a synopsis. So in the early 1900s, a French director by the name of Jean-Claude Barrault directed this play, and he was asked to provide a synopsis. This is what he said. He said, "In Act 1, the orchard is in danger of being sold. In Act 2, the orchard is on the verge of being sold. In Act 3, it is sold, and in Act 4, it has been sold." And that's it. Of course, that isn't it, but the joke there is that nothing ever happens in Chekhov's plays. We'll get to that in a second. That is what makes them funny, though. The fact that the characters don't do anything, and that's part of what makes it funny. I'll explain that in a moment. The real synopsis is this. We join the family at the beginning of the play as they wait for the return of Ranyevskaya, who's the protagonist in the play, to return home from France. She had left to go to France motivated by the loss of her husband and the drowning of her son, and she had taken her Russian lover with her, who wound up spending all of her money in Paris and then abandoning her. And so when the family hears of this, the governess and her daughter and the neighbor go and fetch her and bring her home. And so that's where we join the action of the play. And during the time that she had been gone, her brother Gaev had been managing the estate, but doing it very poorly. He was kind of a bumbling, ineffectual man-child. He can only, he can't do anything other than sort of suck on his boiled sweets and play pool in the air. So as a result of his mismanagement, the estate is up for auction due to a lack of mortgage payments. The family, having had their money stolen from them, has no means to pay these mortgage payments, and so they're in trouble. Many different opportunities are presented to the family to get themselves out of that situation, to save their estate, including possible subdivisions and so forth, but they never seize on any of those opportunities and instead turn in on themselves, and they start to reminisce and lament, and the play ends with the family moving out and the estate being auctioned off, and that is kind of the point of the play. The characters are unable to help themselves. That's what's amusing about it, and that's a theme that's repeated on many different levels with many different characters. Trofimov, who is the young sort of idealist, the perpetual student, is always talking about hard work and achieving things. It's ridiculous how unable he is to actually do anything. He never actually marries the girl, despite having thousands of opportunities to. And that's kind of the theme. That's the thing that we're laughing at in this play. One of the most poignant and sort of tragically comic moments is at the very end of the play, when the whole family is leaving. They lock up the house, and they thought that their manservant Furs was in hospital because he's ancient and very sickly, but he wasn't. He was at home the whole time, and as the doors are locked and all the lights go out, Furs walks into this empty house and tries the doors and finds himself locked in, and he can't escape, and there's no one around. And rather than help himself or break a window, he just lays down and dies, and that's the end of the play. So it is funny, it is hilarious in its way, but Stanislavski insisted that Chekhov had no idea what he had written. During the first read-through of the play, the entire cast had been reduced to tears. And Stanislavski said, "I wept like a woman. I tried to stop myself, but I couldn't. I could hear you saying, 'Excuse me, it's a farce.' No, to the plain man, it is a tragedy." Now, of course, Stanislavski did have a point, and by the way, I forgot to mention that Stanislavski directed the first production of The Cherry Orchard in 1901. He did have a point, though. The comedy can be difficult to find, given the fact that it is so subtle, and the subject material is also, can be painful and difficult to watch, so it can be hard to find that comedy. And anyone reading the play without the right frame of mind or approach, would easily be forgiven for not even knowing it's a comedy at all. But the comedy is there, and once you know what to look for and how to approach it, it's really hard to miss. For example, in one scene, Gaev, who is the brother of Lyubov, sees his sister being very overjoyed at being home, and in his typical snotty, childish sibling way, he decides to put a damper on her mood by telling her that her old nanny has died. And a few lines later he goes on to say that his own maid has left the house to join the police force. And then immediately he pulls a boiled sweet from his pocket and starts playing air billiards. Now, it is subtle, but that is funny. The image of a serf clawing her way out of a difficult situation to join the police force, an authority. That's juxtaposed with the image of Gaev, who is supposedly this wealthy, elite person, just sucking on candies and playing air billiards. The childishness juxtaposed with the maturity and struggle of the lower classes is funny. And it really just shows how infantile and incapable these main characters are. Now, it is subtle, but that's only because we as Americans view comedy through our particular lens of bias. Our comedic sensibilities have been shaped by 100 years of Bob Hope and Jerry Lewis and vaudeville. And the modern American sensibility around comedy is centered around the incongruity theory of comedy, which is the idea that the thing that makes us laugh is the realization of incongruity between our expectation or the concept of a given situation and the actual real objects involved in that situation. Once we realize the incongruity there, that's what makes us laugh. But there are some other theories of what makes something funny that might help us understand exactly what Chekhov meant when he said that this play is a comedy. One of those theories is the superiority theory of comedy, and the other is the relief theory of comedy. The superiority theory of comedy is the notion that the thing that makes us laugh is when we see people behaving foolishly, and we can see their idiocy on full display, and that gives us a sense of superiority because it gives us pleasure to be better than others. The other theory is the relief theory, which says that laughter is a sort of self-regulation in the human animal. It's a homeostatic response to psychological pressure, and so we laugh to dissipate those tensions and sort of give ourselves a balance in our perception. So we can feel superior to Gaev when he acts so childishly, and that gives us a sense of pleasure because it puts us above the elites and the upper class. And we can also feel relief in that situation as we watch an uncomfortable dynamic play out on stage by professional actors. It gives us a sense of reference, and we can take a step back from that uncomfortableness and laugh at it. Another way that we can understand what Chekhov was seeing when he thought of his play as a comedy is if we compare the differences between what constitutes a traditional classical comedy and what constitutes a traditional classic tragedy. In a tragedy, the characters that matter are generally the powerful, the kings, queens, whereas in a comedy, the people that matter tend to be more varied. They can be lower class, upper class. There's more types of characters available in a comedy, and generally more of them as well. The basic unit in a tragedy is the individual, whereas the basic unit in a comedy is the group or the family. In a tragedy, the main characters are very tied up in their situation. They're very closely identified and preoccupied with the events governing their situation. But in a classical comedy, the main characters are more emotionally removed from the events that govern their situation, and so don't take them as seriously. And that affords us a way of taking a step back from their situation and getting a little bit of that relief comedy. And so if we look at it from that perspective, we can clearly see that Chekhov did indeed write a classical comedy, not a tragedy. So one of my goals in directing this play is to find a happy medium between those comedic styles. I'd love to be able to find every joke that Chekhov intended and maybe punch them up a little bit with an American sensibility so that it will have the same comedic effect that it might have had on audiences 100 years ago. And Chekhov is close enough to us in our timeline so that I think we'll be able to do that more easily than, say, with a Shakespeare play. I mean, Shakespeare wrote great plays and he was very funny, of course, but it's 400 years, and in that time period, certain elements of humor and comedy just cannot be recovered. Some of the jokes are just too arcane and too far removed from our current sensibilities. But Chekhov, I think, is not at that point yet, and we're still able to latch onto every bit of comedy and find it just as every bit as funny as audiences would have 100 years ago. And I think it's worth mentioning, I just want to mention, that Stanislavski and Chekhov were contemporaries. They lived at the same time and place, but had very different views of what theater was. As you know, Stanislavski took acting from a very representational, melodramatic, sort of a indicative style to a more naturalistic, realistic sort of approach, where the actors were invited to look inward and find the real emotional truth of a situation and live that truth in real time in front of an audience. Whereas Chekhov went the other way. He started off more naturalistic and in a very short period of time went to something more like symbolism and even absurdism in just a few short years. And by the time he was writing his short plays, they were very experimental almost, had a performance art kind of a quality to them. So there's this intersection, and I think the sweet spot, the way that we do this play right, is by finding that intersection between these trajectories. To find that balance between the sort of introspective, truthful discovering of sort of the Stanislavski method, while still sort of really indulging in the ridiculousness of the characters themselves. We'll be blending different approaches to comedy so that we can sort of extract the most amount of good, hearty American yucks out of this material while still staying very close to the sort of subtle, tongue-in-cheek nature of what Chekhov envisioned. Well, there you have it. That's it for this episode of Colin's Chekhov Corner. I hope you found it as enlightening and entertaining as I did. Now, assuming all goes to plan, Cherry Orchard will be produced in the fall semester of 2020. And if the world is back to normal by then, we'll have auditions in October. Until then, Shashtarovia.